Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be covering some really useful tricks using Vellum in Houdini. This tutorial is going to be kind of an overall overview / intro to Vellum, as well as this one particular really useful production workflow that I use all the time for essentially driving simulated Vellum with input animation. So in this example, this guy we have who's walking around, whose arms are totally simulated, but the rest of his torso is basically the input animation being driven by the mocap. If we take a look over here, we can see this is essentially the animation that I'm feeding into Vellum. And this is the animation that we're getting out. And there's lots of fun ways we can tweak this and get other kinds of looks. So to do this, the first thing that we need is some kind of input animation. This can be a character that you've animated and rigged in another program and brought over as an alembic. It could be an FBX file. It could be a character with some mocap from Mixamo. But for just testing purposes, in Houdini, we have some really useful built-in mocap animation that we can grab. So in the object context, we just type in mocap. You can grab any one of these mocap bipeds, and we get right off the bat this nice little walking guy with textures and stuff. So you can pick any of these different preset animations in here. It's one of him waiting. You can also choose whether you want it to be in place or not. So if you check this off, rather than being stuck in the center, he will actually move around this scene in world space. All kind of nice stuff. So I'm going to set this up real quick by having this mocap biped, and then I'll have it in place, and I'll make a new Geo node called Geo2. I'll dive in there, and we're gonna grab the animation from that mocap biped using an object merge node. An object merge node is just a node that basically grabs some node from any other of your objects or even in the same object, and allows you to bring it into any of the other things for referencing for whatever reason. So I'm going to select mocap biped 2, which is the one that I just made, and I'm going to grab the Geo node, which is where we have our actual walking guy. So that's cool. Now I want him to actually animate walking and not just be standing still. And the way I'm going to do this is by just throwing down a transform node, and we will translate this guy on positive Z this way. And just so I don't have to keyframe anything, I will use a handy little expression over here, which is at time. So time is like a global attribute in Houdini, and if you just type in at capital T time, you can call that into any channel or whatever. So that's pretty good. Now he's walking. His feet are sliding a little bit. He's moving a little bit faster than he's actually walking. So I'm gonna adjust this slightly just by, instead of it just being at time, it's gonna be at time times 0.8. So it'll be a little bit slower and it'll match up a little bit better. And that feels good enough for what we need here. So cool, moving on. The next step is going to be to create a proxy geometry that we're going to use for the simulation. I don't want to use this geometry that we have here, which is super high quality and has all these different bits and intersecting things like the eyeball geo in here, or maybe not, but it has all these different parts to it, and I don't want to really have to worry about that when I'm simming. I just want one kind of nice airtight mesh, And thankfully in Houdini, it's really easy to set that up. And this is a really common production workflow that I use all the time. So the first thing we want to do is create a rest pose. So a pose where he's just kind of standing still. And the easiest way to do that is just going to be to drop a time shift node. By default, the time shift node has this $F function in here, which means it grabs the current frame that you're on. And you'll see as I scroll through here, it changes the number in here because of that expression based on what frame we're on in the timeline. So I'll just right click, delete channels, and just let it be 1 there. So now it's just stuck at frame 1. I could also, instead of deleting the channels, I could just hit this to show the expression $F and just type in 1 here. And now he's not moving. So that's cool. Now, in order to create our Proxy Geo, I kind of want to make this new closed geometry based on like the volume of this character. So in order to do that, we're just going to use a VDB. So I'll drop down the VDB from polygons, and I have a whole video explaining how VDBs work and what VDBs and volumes and all that stuff are. So check that out on my YouTube channel if you're curious for more information on that. And I'm going to, because this is a very low resolution VDB, I'm going to drop the voxel size down to something like 1/10 of that. And that is something that's much nicer. So now we can see some of the detail in the fingers and all that. And then I'm going to turn this back into a closed polygonal object by throwing on a remesh node right after the VDB from polygons. And this will give us just triangles all over our mesh. And technically this is not the best topology, but it's perfect for what we need, which is just something to sort of be a placeholder and work for our Vellum simulation. So awesome. Now the problem that we have is we don't have this guy animated. We have this guy animated over here. And if we take out this time shift node, this will animate, but it's regenerating the polygons in the VDB on every single frame, which is A, really slow, and B, if we middle click on here, we'll see this is our point count. It's 2,984 on this frame, and on this other frame, it's 3,069. So the point count is changing every single frame, which is not going to work for what we need. We can't simulate something with consistency if the point count's jumping all over the place and it doesn't know where one point was on one frame to the next frame. So we want a consistent point count. So the way that we're gonna get the animation back onto this guy is with a really useful node called the point deform. Point deform. And the point deform requires 3 inputs. The first is the mesh that we want to deform. So that's our new geometry over here. So I'll plug that in there. And then the rest point lattice. So basically we're going to be plugging the rest point lattice and then the deformed point lattice, which are the 2 versions of our original animated geometry that we're going to be using to drive the animation on this remeshed guy right here. So I'll plug the rest point lattice where we have our rest of our walking zombie man into the time shift, this is essentially our rest right here. And then our deformed or animated geometry is right before that, before we tell it to stick onto frame 1 right here. And now we have a nice animated guy and the timeline is playing much faster, and middle click on here and the point count is going to be the same 3,028 every single frame. So that's awesome. Now we're ready for our Vellum simulation. I'm gonna explain how Vellum works a little bit. Basically, the key thing to know about Vellum is that it is essentially, at its core, just another type of particle simulation in Houdini. And every point on our Vellum simulation is a particle, and the thing that makes it sort of special as a Vellum simulation is that we're giving it certain constraints. and I'll sort of explain how that works. But basically, all these points will be kind of constrained to each other in different ways depending on what kind of constraints we use for our Vellum Sim. And you'll see there's a ton of different options. I'm only going to cover a couple of the different constraint types today, but it's definitely worth looking around and playing with the other kinds that we have. So first, I will drop down a Vellum soft body, and we're going to use a strut soft body. And this creates two different constraint setups for us right here. So basically, what these are doing is each one is generating a different type of constraints for our Vellum simulation. So I'll plug this into our point deform. And if we click on any of these, we'll just see the same geometry that we have set up. But what the middle input is of these, the left input is our geometry, and the middle input is our constraint geometry. So if we want to actually see what the constraint geometry looks like, we can grab a null and plug it into the middle input of any of these. And you'll see now we can actually see our constraints. So from this, you can kind of see what it's doing with the cloth constraint, which is that it's actually creating these constraints from each point to the other nearby points in the Vellum simulation. And that's allowing it to sort of behave like a cloth when we simulate it. So if I throw down a Vellum solver and I just plug it into these guys, so we're just plugging it into the cloth constraints. And I also turn on the ground so we can see it collide. It will essentially behave like as if it's cloth. So that's cool. But then we have this other one that's being generated when we generate the Vellum soft body struts preset. And this one is, in addition to the sort of outer layer of constraints that are being created by the Vellum cloth constraint, it's adding in these strut constraints, which are these sort of ones going through the body that we can see. And I think if we plug this directly into here, we can see this is basically what's being created by the strut constraints. It's these struts that are like kind of going through the volume of our object, and the stiffness of these struts is saying how much these sort of lengths of these constraints are trying to be maintained. So if we plug the cloth with the struts into the Vellum solver, and hit play, we'll see we have a little bit of mass now. It's like the head is sort of staying, the volume is staying there because of those struts. Now, if we go onto the settings for these, you'll see we have these settings, and the most important one right off the bat is this stiffness setting. So there's a stretch stiffness and a bend stiffness. And in the cloth constraints, we have both of those, and it's saying basically this is the number that we're putting in for the stiffness for the stretch, and we're saying, because that number is super high, we're saying maintain this length very stiffly. So don't kind of allow it to stretch very much at all. But if we lowered this down a lot, it would sort of have a lot more leeway in terms of letting our cloth stretch out, and it would sort of behave a little bit differently, maybe like as if it were like a soap bubble being blown or something like that. That kind of material is allowed to sort of stretch a lot more than, for example, a piece of cloth. And you can play with that and get different results. In the strut constraints, however, the default preset is just set to 10, which is not very strong, which is why when we play this, he's still looking pretty clothy and not maintaining a ton of volume. But if we crank this up to, say, 1,000, now we actually keep a lot of our soft body volume, which is super nice and maybe more of what you want. I'm going to say, let's kind of go in between 10 and 1,000 and set our stretch stiffness of our strut constraints to 1,000. And hit play. And now we get something kind of in between that I think is kind of nice. They end up sort of keeping the volume of our initial guy, but they do get sort of like compressed and stuff a bit more than when we had it set to 1,000. So that's nice. So anyway, hopefully that makes some sense. That's sort of how those constraints are working. And then with the Vellum solver, it's just saying add gravity, add, you know, whatever other forces we have. We could set up some wind if we want to be positive X wind and blow our guy over here. But based on all that stuff, push the particles around and then try to resolve the constraints that we have set up, and based on the stiffness of those constraints, sort of push and pull all these points on this mesh to where we want. So that's just generally sort of what Vellum is doing under the hood, and it's just kind of a good thing to keep in mind when you're tweaking these settings. The other important takeaway from this is I would sort of think of this stiffness parameter on any of these things almost as like the weight of the constraints, so like the strength. And these go from 0 to, you know, millions. If you want it to be like completely stiff, just set it to a very, very high number, essentially. But it's more or less kind of like the same idea as on, for example, like a shader. You have like the diffuse weight and the specular weight and all that stuff. It's like the weight parameter is the way I would sort of think of the stiffness in Vellum. So awesome. We have our little soft body thing. But we want this to kind of follow some amount of our initial input animation with our walking guy over here. Right now it's just starting and then falling. So there's a really useful, I'm going to turn off this wind here. There's a really useful other kind of constraint that I use all the time. This is the third kind that I'm going to show you guys in this video. So if we drop it at Vellum constraints, we'll see there's all these different constraint types. There's distance along edges, which is actually kind of like the same as the cloth constraints, except it doesn't have that bend stiffness attribute. So it kind of lets it bend infinitely. But we want to go down to the pin to target constraint, which is the one that allows you to sort of control your Vellum sim with your input animation. And I use this constantly. I have tons of examples of me using this. So for example, for all of these characters here, some of it's being animated by hand, and then I'm just running a simulation on top of it. So I'm getting this really nice secondary action, partially sim, partially animated stuff, which is essentially what the pin to target constraints lets you do. We're going to attach this here at the end, and now we have all these extra little constraints, and we can look at them. They're just these pins, basically, where all the points are of our input mesh. So I'll bring the pin to target constraints into the picture over here. And then if we hit play, you'll see nothing happens because it's just being pinned to the target of the first frame of the animation now. If we go to the pin to target constraints, we'll see we have this match animation checkbox. So we probably want to check that if we want the input animation to affect our simulation. Hit that and boom, now it's animated, but it's not being simulated at all still. The key sort of useful thing for the pin to target constraints is to turn on soft for the pin type and the orientation type. And that gives us control over all these stretch and bend parameters. So now if we play, because the stretch stiffness is still really high, we're not going to notice much difference. You'll notice that the feet are kind of colliding with the ground now a little bit, but it's pretty stiff and it's sticking to the animation pretty strongly because the stiffness value is so high. But if we set this to like say 10, and then we hit play over here, oops. Now you'll see he's kind of bouncing a little bit, and there's some amount of little extra simulation, but it's also trying to sort of snap with a stiffness of 10 back to the input animation. Boop, 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 boop. Wiggly. Set this to 1, it'll be really getting affected by the gravity a lot, and then kind of keep trying to get pulled back up with this sort of like springy low stiffness. Now it looks like that. And that could be kind of fun, and there's definitely useful cases for this. But the most useful way to use this stuff is to tell Vellum where to make parts of it very stiff and where to make parts of it very simulated. So there's a way to do that, which is by adding a attribute that we're going to scale the stiffness of the pin constraints by. So if we click on scale by attribute, then it creates this stretch stiffness parameter, and you can name this whatever you want, but I'll leave it at stretch stiffness just for consistency. And I'm going to set my stiffness of my Vellum Sim up to 10,000. So it's pretty stiff. And now there's lots of ways that we can edit this stretch stiffness parameter in here. The way that I'm going to do it is with a paint node. So I'm going to drop down a paint sop right here. And the paint sop is great. It lets you paint colors. Right now the color is set to white, and this is all white. But if I set it to like red, it'll let us paint red on this guy. But we don't want to paint color, the CD attribute that it's painting by default. We want to paint instead the stretch stiffness attribute, which we can do by saying override color and changing this to stretch stiffness spelled correctly. And now if we go to our geometry spreadsheet, we'll see we have this stretch stiffness attribute, but it's set to 0. Set to 0 all over his body, and we're visualizing it in this node as well. And I can paint with my thing set to 111, and now these red parts are going to be 1 while the purple parts are going to be 0. And you can also change the visualization from infrared to white to red or grayscale, whatever makes the most sense to you. I'm a fan of the infrared mode, so I'll just keep using that for now. And if we go in the geometry spreadsheet, we'll see now we have some of these points painted with 1, some painted with in-between values, so the stuff that's not purple or red, and some of it's just still 0, all the purple bits. So I'm going to apply to all this 111 value, and then I'm going to paint 0 the parts that I want to be nice and floppy. So I will paint this arm over here, and I'll paint the head. Basically, you can paint whatever you want, whatever you think will be cool to be driven by the simulation. And maybe I'll paint like the back of his leg over here and just see how that goes. It'll be fun. And then the other thing that I usually do for good measure is switch from paint mode to smooth, and then apply that to all, which just will smooth kind of everything out. There's other ways you could do that too, but this is a good way of sort of using this workflow. So awesome. Now, if I play the sim in those parts that have those values, and we can visualize it over here by dropping down a visualize node and switching in the visualizers from P to stretch stiffness. Now we can see these are the 0 parts, these are the 1 parts, and hit play. And nice. Now we have our droopy zombie man. And so that works pretty damn well. Now there's other ways we can control these attributes. One way that I like doing a lot now that I'm a little bit more familiar with Houdini and with Vex is to use point wrangles. So if we want to drop down a point wrangle over here, we could do something like say at stretch stiffness, which is our stretch stiffness attribute, equals rel bbox at p dot y. And we'll see in here what that's doing is, one, it's overwriting our paint node, because I'm just saying, even though we have stretch stiffness here, I'm saying, okay, now stretch stiffness is going to be equal to this instead. But I could add it if we wanted, or I could multiply it if we wanted. So now we kind of have a combination. But I'm just going to set it to equal. And what this is doing, rel bbox at p dot y, oh, I didn't delete that properly. There we go. Is saying create a bounding box around our object, a relative bounding box, rel bbox, and basically set the position value to be 0 on the y-axis on the bottom and 1 on the top of the box. So on the box is basically we're sort of making the max values 1 and the min values 0. And another fun way we could visualize this is by setting at p to rel bbox at p. Oh, I forgot my parenthesis. And then now we have our whole guy being sort of limited to the 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1 values, and it's just setting the max on each frame to be the max of all those values and the minimum on each frame of all those values to be the minimum. And that's pretty fun. So it's a handy thing for something like this where we want to basically say make the stretch stiffness from the bottom to the top weak to strong. Or maybe let's say we want the opposite of this. Let's say we want the top to be weak and the bottom to be strong. There's a couple ways we could do this. Obviously we could, because it's set between 0 and 1, we could subtract 2 and then multiply it by -1, which is a bit of a weird way of doing it. Instead, I'm going to use a fit function, fit, and then the first thing you put in the parentheses is the value that you want to fit. So rel bbox at p dot y, and then fit that, which is between 0 and 1, so the min and the max, and fit it to 1 and 0 instead of 0 to 1. So basically flip it. And now we'll see at the top up here, it's going to be floppy and then not floppy. Maybe that'll be cool. So let's hit play and we see, yeah, that kind of works. It becomes more jiggly up at the top. Maybe we like that. Another thing we could do is say, well, I want it to map this range instead of from 0 to 1, the old 0 to 1 value. I want it to set it between the old 0 and 0.5 value. So here it becomes black, and then above that it's all just black. So I can just set the old max to be 0.5 instead, and then now I have that, and if I hit play, then I get this really crazy animation of our guy just kind of being dragged around. So super nice. So anyway, there's lots of ways you could tweak this, obviously. We could also, instead of using Y, we could use X, so it's going from left to right, or Z, so it's going from back to forwards. And now the right side is dangly and the left side isn't. So yeah, tons of potential, as you could probably imagine with this stuff. So awesome. That's kind of the majority of our setup. There's one kind of last thing for production purposes that we want to keep in mind, which is that now our animated vellum mesh is this crazy, terribly topologized stand-in geometry. So we want to get back our original geometry. And if you think for a minute, you might realize that there is a way to do this that we've already learned in this lesson, which is to use the point-to-form SOP yet again. So I'm going to do the same thing we did in the beginning, basically. I'm going to drop a time shift over here. and then set it to frame 1 over here, so it's not moving, and then point deform, and then plugging the mesh to deform, which is going to be our original rest pose mesh here, and then plug in the rest point lattice, which is our stalled remeshed guy, and then our deformed point lattice, which is our animated Vellum one. Then over here, now we have this guy with the correct topology and all of our other attributes or whatever we might have on him working great. So hopefully that was useful, and hopefully it sort of helped you get going with Vellum and made the whole thing make a lot more sense and be a lot less scary. I definitely wish someone had explained it like this to me originally. But yeah, I find this stuff to be super useful. If you make anything useful with this, definitely let me know. And I am soon going to post a more advanced Vellum tutorial. And I'll give you a quick little preview of the kind of stuff that's going to be in that right now. So with this tutorial, I'm basically going to show how to animate different Vellum parameters in DOPS during the simulation. So you'll be able to do things like make the balloon inflating and deflating and, you know, kind of breathing, or you'll be able to do things like trigger the inflation of our little guy over here with attribute transfer from the sphere. So the sphere is driving the inflation of the balloon as it gets nearby. Or you'll be able to do things like keyframe this animation so that over time he sticks to the animated geometry less and less and becomes more just a floppy simulation. And this is a little bit of a more advanced thing that took me a while to figure out, but is now something that I also use all the time and find to be extremely useful. So keep your eyes peeled for that tutorial coming very soon.